Good afternoon, everybody, or whatever time of day that you're listening to this, and a very warm welcome to episode 11. I'm very excited today to have Dr. Tinashe Chandauka with me in the virtual room. He is a Rhodes Scholar, a doctor, of course, and a venture capitalist associate as well. Tinashe, thank you so much for joining on the show, and a very warm welcome to you.
Yeah, Tafadzwa, where can I start? It's really great to be on your show, to be engaging with you and your audience
Yeah.
about like a lot of issues that I think are pretty pertinent in a time like we're living in.
Yeah.
And I also think, just grounding our conversation in the fact that you came to visit me in Oxford not so long ago. So I
Exactly.
really appreciate that too.
Exactly. No, awesome. Awesome. So to kickstart us off, we're going to start off fairly light and then we're going to dive right in. So to
Yeah.
kickstart us off, I typically ask people, typically ask guests on the show just to help people get to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where you're from, what did you study, what do you do, and what are you passionate about as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, maybe we can start with where am I from? And I
Mhm.
think that's a very interesting question to ask. I'm one of those people who has many homes,
Yeah.
and modern writers have started referring to this concept of where are you local to.
Yeah.
So I think I'll attack that question from looking at it as like, where is Tinashe local to? And I'd say that I'm a Joburger, right? Like, that's where my heart is. I think that's where I was as a teenager. And, there was a pandemic, and yeah, I was in Joburg. I could have been anywhere else in the world. I had been I'd been out in Canada, I'd been in the UK. And then when I could see that there was going to be a global lockdown, I went
Yeah.
back to Johannesburg. So I'm local to Johannesburg. But I
Mm.
think something else just to say is that, Cape Town is a very special place to me.
Yeah.
I think that's where I became like, a man.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm local to Cape Town in Johannesburg. Yeah.
Ah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. So, you know, tell us a little bit about your daily routine. What's a typical day in your life? Are you a morning or evening person? How does sort of your typical type day go? Particularly, I think now, in the pandemic, I think it's obviously a bit of a shakeup for everyone. But I'm quite interested to hear what's a typical day in your life.
Yeah. So I think my day probably starts off at about 4:30 or 5 a.m. Um,
Okay.
I'll sit in my room and I'll think.
Hmm.
I've started to do meditation. A couple of
Yeah.
years ago, I was just under like a lot of stress, and I'm not good at meditation, like people who sit out of their bed, watch the sunrise, that sort of thing. But what I mean by that is like I actually contemplate. I run through the day
Yeah.
mentally in bed and start thinking about, what are things that I can do, what how can I bring the best of myself to the day, and then I like clear my thoughts, just listen to myself and just see what space I'm at. And then I'll try and fit in a run or some kind of physical activity, swimming or a cycle.
Yeah.
And yeah, then I'll go to work. And
Mm.
then the clock just runs. There's never enough time.
And then all of a
So
sudden, it's the end of the
I
day.
know I have to be home and joining my partner or friends for dinner. And then
Mm.
after that, maybe a bit more work in the evening. And then, yeah,
Yeah,
try and
yeah,
catch some sleep. Sleep is super important.
yeah. That sounds like a very fast-paced day, and I know something which I've probably experienced quite a bit is that that with the sort of global pandemic, the days sort of just morph into one. So you're not really sure, what's a Monday, what's a Thursday, what's a Friday. um,
Yeah,
then other than the fact that on Saturday it's obviously typically a little bit slower, but as we know, you and I are here in an interview on a Saturday. but
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I wanted to ask you. So I don't know. I'm actually not too sure if restaurants are open for sit down in the UK, but once they are open, or if they are open, what meal did you have if they are open? What was your first meal that you've had if you've gone there? And
yeah.
if you haven't gone, what meal are you gonna first have? Once you get back into a restaurant.
So I'm gonna caveat that by saying that my girlfriend is a very wonderful cook. I also cook, but it's
Yeah,
nowhere near that. So I'm very
yeah,
lucky that during lockdown I've been spoiled.
yeah,
Um, but we both love a restaurant called Zato's. It's close to our home. It's run by a Palestinian family, and
mhm,
some really good Middle Eastern street food.
yeah,
Super healthy, like decent prices. You go there and you feel like you're a wealthy man, and the food is just so awesome. I'm surprised they don't have a Michelin star yet or something like that. But it's pretty popular in Oxford, and it's off one of the. It's in a very diverse neighborhood, so
yeah,
you've got quite a lot of like Southeast Asian, East Asian,
yeah.
Jamaican restaurants all in this, and there's Zato's Bakery.
Oh,
And on that note, I also want to say this: having experienced two different kind of lockdowns,
yeah,
the South Africans on this one, credit to President Cyril Ramaphosa and the others, but really took COVID seriously. Um,
mm,
I must say that, like, being on the British end of it, today is called Super Saturday. So the pubs are reopening, the
okay,
beaches are open, people
mm,
are free to have markets and events that are not planned. So, in other
yeah,
words, you can just rock up with your boots and sell bread from the back.
yeah.
And I'm pretty concerned because I don't think coronavirus
Go
has
yet.
got. No one wears masks. Yeah, yeah,
That's a very sort of different, sort of cultural approach, I
yeah,
think. And I must say, I do commend the South African government at large, particularly the president, I think, for acting really early, but also I think critically for me, I think acting on the advice of medical professionals. So, I think it's one thing I think something that we find with world leaders around the world is the most dangerous position is when you think you know, right? When you think you know best rather than when you're willing to accept that actually I need to listen to other people who know, about this stuff better than I do. So I
yeah,
think we're really fortunate to have a leader who is willing to listen and is willing to have people around the table.
yeah.
So, are you a football fan by any chance? And
Hundred
if so,
percent.
what club do you support? I know it's been a big week in the UK from a footballing perspective, but I can see
Yeah.
from your face that it hasn't been a good week for you.
Oh well, my our arch nemesis. So to all you Manchester United fans, I am one of you. It's been a tough decade. Uh, and yeah, like Liverpool win sometimes,
Yeah,
and sometimes Steven Gerrard is not playing on their team to ruin it at the end of the season, and they actually win a title. So all credit to Liverpool.
some some
Um,
some Liverpool
they
fans
deserve it.
that's a bit too soon. Like it's still a bit.
No, I mean it's done now. I mean it's
Look,
completely done.
all I can say is I think the most painful job in the world is being an Arsenal fan, and that's unfortunately something that I am, and I've learned a lot of resilience from that process.
there's actually, we have something in common, right? So
Yeah,
when I look at Alex Ferguson, fantastic manager, but there's a discussion to be had about succession planning in teams.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas Alex Ferguson walked out, I think, with a championship under his belt and was like, I'm now going.
yeah.
Um, on the other hand, with Arsene Wenger, that period happened while you were still around. I think that season was 2005.
Yeah.
It took another, what,
Left about
13
13.
years?
Oh, cool. So let's dive right in. So we're talking firstly about this this journey of becoming a South African, right?
Yeah,
Um, complex sort of thing. I think for me, if somebody asks me, where's home?
yeah,
Um, physically where I was born, like you, Zimbabwe, right? But home is a complex thing for me to answer. Because home for me is most often where my loved ones are. So at the moment, home is two places: it's South Africa and Zimbabwe, right? And the UK actually, because I also have family in the UK, for example. So, but I really want to dive into this becoming a South African topic, because I think the world at large is becoming, despite the fact that we're not moving as much physically at the moment, but we're becoming a lot more global in our nature. I mean, you're sitting currently in the UK. I'm currently sitting in Johannesburg. You're sitting in a small, lovely town of Oxford, which is a dream of a town, and a gorgeous town as well. And we're talking as if we're in the same room, because we are. We're in the same
Yeah.
virtual room, right? But talk to me firstly about your journey from Zimbabwe to South Africa, right? And what I want to know is, how easy was it for you to leave Zimbabwe back then and to come to to a country like South Africa, and settle in South Africa back then?
Wow. So South Africa was always something abstract to me when I was young. So, I was born in the late 80s when the end of the Cold War, Zimbabwe was really, I think, at the peak of its post civil
Yeah,
struggle life. So the equivalent would be, at this point, maybe talk about South Africa in the mid 2000s
yeah,
from let's say a black cultural perspective, where it's
mhm,
10 years into a post democratic society. It's not unusual to have black professionals who are lawyers, judges,
mhm,
doctors, succeeding in professions. And,
yes,
and when I was born into my family at this point, my parents were well on a professional path. And
mhm,
so in Zimbabwe, almost like homogeneously black in terms of my own black cultural background, um, I would see on TV that there was another country called South Africa where people were still struggling with these questions about civil rights and equality.
mhm,
And every now and then I get these science textbooks about with denominations in rand and talking about these towns with pictures like Cape Town that look like Europe. And it
yeah,
was an abstract concept until 2001, when my parents were very lucky to get a job in Johannesburg. My mom is a publisher. She loves books. She's also a teacher by background, and she had
mhm,
a phenomenal job to work for an international firm in Johannesburg.
mhm,
She's been running the Zimbabwean arm of another large international publishing house, and then she moved to Johannesburg.
mhm,
Initially I stayed in Zimbabwe. I wanted to go to a traditional Catholic boys' school.
mhm,
Anyone who comes from a Zimbabwean background will know, it's like a rite of passage in
yeah,
a family that someone has to go to boarding school. It has to be a Catholic one, run by priests. You have to have a hard time. When you get out, now you're one of us.
yeah,
Um, but because of the economic situation and things that were going on, I mean, I'll openly say that one night our school had all the cutlery stolen, stuff like that. And
mhm,
the priests would take every effort, because the school was a prestigious one in Zimbabwe, to keep things working. Things like supply of bread, eggs. It was all an issue because of hyperinflation.
yeah,
We just came to the conclusion that for the amount of resources we were expending and the kind of environment that I was in, maybe it was better to go to South Africa and just be closer to family that had moved there. And
mhm,
so began this journey. And I guess we'll touch on that maybe if we talk about my schooling background. But the contrast between a completely black school, in terms of the student body, with the only people who were non-black, not even being the general teachers, but being the priests
yeah,
who were Asian or German or British, to being in South Africa, where it's sometimes in some spaces as a young black person you are actually the minority. In
yeah,
those spaces it was a complete contrast.
yeah, yeah, and a massive shift. And so, how easy was it for you to connect to South Africans? When you sort of came across initially. Given that obviously you were quite young, I think
Yeah,
there's the conversation to be had about how difficult it is for adults to connect with each other. Once you
yeah.
sort of get thrust into a new social system. But how easy was it for you, or not easy, as a child coming into the South African schooling system and into South Africa at large to
Yeah,
connect?
yeah. I think that's a really good question. I actually think it's been an ongoing process even now. I think I think I arrived in a very privileged environment in that by this juncture in my own parents' life, in terms of the kind of resources that they could deploy to my education, I was able to move from, let's say, being at a state primary school in Zimbabwe, having gone to a very traditional Catholic boarding schools, which are often subsidized by the Catholic Church, to then going to one of the premier independent schools in South Africa.
Yeah.
That you can see the narrative arc of my parents' life through the schools that I'm now able to go through, right, through time. So, arriving at St. Stithians, my first experience of the place, right, was the general students. And when you're young, people I think are generally welcoming. So the first bunch to welcome me among the day scholars were the Zimbabwean students. So, black and white. But immediately, and I've always wanted to do a play about this, is like, imagine you're a black Zimbabwean student in 2004, and you're meeting a black, so I mean a white young student who also came from Zimbabwe. Like the questions that are being asked. So like, do you guys have a farm? How long have you had a farm? Those kind of things. And I mean, we might say that with a grin.
Yeah.
But
those were difficult questions, right? And questions as well.
Yeah. And so like I found that I think like among like let's say the Zimbabwean diaspora, there was some friendships, but the people who really welcomed me were the black boarding house students. And I think when we talk about when we look at what happens, let's say in South African independent schools, the truth is like a lot of the time people who are in boarding houses are there because they live far away from home, or because of the legacy of South Africa. If they're black students, quite literally sometimes their parents, because of where they live, couldn't live in the geographical areas of the school because of the Group Areas Act. So you might find that a student on scholarship who lives in Soweto, Alexandria, might actually have to like come to school, be in the boarding house, and then on weekends go home or at the end of the term. So particularly the black South African students were so welcoming, man. I got introduced to house music. I was there, Soul Candy Session 1, all that stuff, and like having people explain to me who Pitch Black Afro was. And at the same time, like, listening to, I think Dave Matthews went to St. Stithians. So, like having other guys explain that cultural dimension and watching the passion for rugby by both white and black South African students, and then chatting to a mixed race person who then explains to you the history of why maybe they don't support the Springboks and why they support the All Blacks. So it was fascinating.
I think that's really fascinating, right? Because I think what I'm hearing as you're talking is you had to sort of learn the culture, but you actually learned to listen to various different groups of people, and you learn to sort of listen with an open mind to understand what shifts, what actually makes a culture tick, what makes people like the things that they like. What is it about Soul Candy, right? That's so cool, right? I remember when I got to high school, it was on Soul Candy Sessions 5. By then it was like, okay, like what is this? Like, was the thing, right? And like going through that sort of step of learning, I think a culture and its practices is something that's so valuable and so important, because in a way that you go across the world, having to sort of go into that step of actually let me understand, about these people, what they actually do, what makes them love the things that they love, and what makes them, not love some of these things. So, what makes them not passionate about the Springboks, it becomes a complex conversation. And I think that's a really important trait that you did pick up. So I want to, touch on a little bit about, your journey through St. Stithians. And one of the questions was from the floor before we did the episode, opened up Q&A. You went to boarding school, so you were actually a boarder in Saints. What was the impact of being in boarding school for you? And particularly, of course, you enter a new culture, but you're now also in a boarding house, right?
Yeah.
What was the impact of that? And how did you go from being the foreign student, right, who came in with knowing no one, right, absolutely not knowing anybody there, not understanding a single clue about South African culture other than the posters of Cape Town and the things that look like Europe and those things, right, and the things that you saw on TV and the things that you saw in the textbooks. How did you go from that to actually being, the leader of the school, in at the end of your matric, or in your matric year? How was that sort of shift? Take us along a little bit on that journey.
Yeah, I think others are probably better placed to comment on this because when you're living through it, you often just don't see the events.
Yeah.
And again, I come back to this thing of song and culture. A big part of boarding house life was song and culture. We had Afrikaans young students, we had black students who came from townships, we had foreign students from Japan. But you know what? At the end of every day, right, we'd have this thing, roll call, right?
Yeah.
Everyone in the boarding house comes in and we sit, and everyone is counted, but then we'd even do a cultural play every night. Each grade was in charge of doing a 5-minute skit, stuff like that. And that's culture just brought us all together. And we had this inter-house competition and we wanted to be number one. So, we would practice for all the events, like the inter-house play. And then we think about what play are we going to do? And then the one year, I think we did a play, an anti-apartheid play. Yeah. And everyone in the boarding house learned anti-apartheid songs. So, like what that meant was that, like, even if we were at a sports event, it meant that like we had one song we could all sing. In fact, we ended up having like 30 songs we could all sing together. And because we're actually as boarding students at the school all the time, and I was in Colin's house and the other boarding house, Mount Stevens, we're at dinner, we're chatting with these guys. They also know the songs we can sing because we'd sing them outside their house to annoy them. And we would know their songs because vice versa. But what ends up happening is you end up having this group of really passionate people who, because they live at the school and actually know how everything is run, including the secrets, they become custodians of the school. And so my role in the boarding house was even down to say, like, I would look down out of my window and the grass was dying. I would lobby for the grass to get watered. I would water it myself for months sometimes. So it's like you end up having ownership of the boarding house. The tuck shop was failing. I got involved in that and we turned it around. Nowadays, they call that private equity. Back then, we were doing good. I discovered that the margins you can get on hot chocolate are like massive. But, we drove all the profits back into like fixing the TV room so that we could watch better rugby on better couches and pool tables. So you end up, because you run the boarding house and the boarding house is at the center of the school, because whether you're on an academic scholarship, rugby scholarship, cricket scholarship, half of those teams, those guys in the boarding house.
Yeah.
So the traditions that people pass on to each other give you the leadership schools, the background history of the school to basically understand how to run it. It's like being in the school's leadership institutes 24/7, except you're being taught by your best friends.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's really, really profound. And what advice would you have for a foreign school child? Who, firstly, let's break that into two. Someone who is, one, considering coming to South Africa. Obviously, once all of the sort of the coronavirus dies down and everything, and we start to reopen the borders and everything like that. Yeah. What would you advise somebody like that? And secondly, what would you advise somebody who is at, in South Africa as a foreign school child, based on the learnings that you've had, what sort of 2 or 3 things would you advise them?
I think so. I also want to say that I'm not perfect and I haven't figured this out. But I think the most important thing, I've been someone who's gone to different countries as well.
Yeah.
Be yourself. Like, don't lie. Like, if you just don't like some things, don't participate. And also don't necessarily fake values that you maybe don't have. So that's the first thing, is like be yourself. And I think people love people who are genuine, honest, and share the best of themselves, right? The second thing I'd say is learn a language. Try and learn a language, a South African language. And I think particularly if you're short of time, I think there's merits in learning a Black South African language. Because once you learn people's language, you understand so much of the culture.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the time to learn the culture, so I mean a language particularly, please make the time, but also like immerse yourself completely. If Casper Nyovest is gonna fill up the dome, go. You know, if there's gonna be a play at the Johannesburg Theatre about Sizwe Banzi is dead and John Carney is gonna come back to do it, go.
Yeah.
If there's an opportunity to help out in community service in an area, go there. If you have a chance to like have South African friends who invite you to like a barbecue or sorry, a braai, look at me, or stuff like that. Like, and by the way, like I know that I'm at risk of saying that I'm like talking about South African stereotype experiences, but I could give others, but some of them are laced with like pain and emotion, in the sense that like what's the current issue in South Africa right now? It's gender-based violence, right?
Yeah.
What's being done around that? If you're at UCT and people are protesting about an issue that affects gender-based violence, I think it's something that's important to understand. Like, go to the talks, go to and speak to the activists, understand why gender-based violence is a big issue in South Africa. And as they explain that to you, you end up having a framework of understanding the role of, like, let's say, the difficult journey that women have had in South Africa.
Yeah.
And with that, men. And then there's the issue of race that then comes up. So you actually end up learning about the place. So number one, I guess, be yourself. Number two is learn a language or immerse yourself in culture. And I think the third thing, finally, is I think knowing that you have a place as a human being on this planet. Doesn't matter where you are, you add value. And there'll always be noise. But like, if you believe that you have value, I think you'll have the confidence to survive a lot of difficult things that come your way based on your race, gender, nationality.
That's really good.
That's all I can speak about on this topic. Yeah.
That's really powerful and really profound. And thank you for sharing that. So let's talk a little bit about your transition to UCT. So you went to go study medicine at the University of Cape Town. How is this as a culture shift from a South African private school? Any different, or did you sort of have to learn and unlearn a lot of stuff in that sort of shift from school into university?
It was huge. I wouldn't say, and here's the kicker, and I felt that I've had to unlearn things more by leaving South Africa.
Okay.
But at UCT, I became far more conscious. So again, it's like culturally, I grew up in Zim for a certain portion of my life, mainly Black country, where a lot of the people in positions of power are actually Black. Look, speak, may think like people in your community. Whereas when I was at Stithians College, I had teachers who were non-Black for the first time, right? And positions of authority were occupied mainly by people from cultural groups that were not the same as me. So it was like learning how to navigate that environment. Then you have the University of Cape Town, which, as a publicly funded university, forged during the end of the English colonial period going into apartheid, was largely a white institution, right? So like the culture of the institution is one that is quite European, Anglo-centric, even more so than in some ways, like, let's say, Stithians, except that like it's how can I put it? It's sort of, it's not, but it really is. And then because it's a publicly funded institution, now you're really seeing all walks of South African life on campus. And the most stark thing for me was the week after O week. So now classes are starting, right? And UT had this thing where we do a computer literacy test. I don't know whether others on your show or yourself had to do this, but they want to check whether your computer skills are at a standard that can enable you maybe to start doing the program.
Yeah.
I did this computer test, and I think I was done with it in like 15 minutes. And I remember looking across me, and I saw like someone next to me was still quite far, like from finishing this test. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So walked out, and during during this week, I discovered that if you failed that test, you had to redo the test. And if you didn't pass that test, you had to go on what was called like an intervention program, where instead of like, let's say, doing a 3-year degree, you might have to do a 4-year degree because they're going to give you a year of catch-up materials.
Yeah.
And you know, the racial and cultural makeup groups of the mainstream course versus the intervention programs is very different, right? And you end up seeing that like inequalities in society are being like magnified by these things. As the term went by, let's say I had time because I had maybe finished my assignment, because the truth is, like, going to an independent school in South Africa, you were maybe doing like, let's say, music, sport, and something else. And like there are all these skills that are being put in the curriculum in terms of, let's say, computer literacy, planning projects, referencing, that you aren't learning at university. And I'm not saying that these cultural and economic differences weren't there in the independent schools, but it's quite different when you're playing a catch-up game at age 14 versus now doing it at 19 with even less resources and tutoring available. So now, the thing that really struck me was like, you've been to like, let's say, a party, and you can see that some people in your class are missing.
Yeah.
You go back to the tutorial, let's say, so we had this big chemistry tut on on a Friday morning, and you would know that a student's Thursday night is the big night.
Yes.
And, you know, you saw some faces at some of these clubs on the Thursday, because, you know, I didn't partake in these things. But then on Friday morning, you know, you see the eyes that are tired, but people are finishing the chemistry tutorials. And then you see other people are struggling, but these guys were in the library the whole night, right? Working, getting up on computer skills so that they could then do the tut. Yes. And they're struggling. And you start to see that it's a 6-year program, like let's say in the case of medicine, or maybe in total also like nearly 6 years in architecture.
Yeah.
You can see that by the time you end up at the degree, it's like Survivor. If you survive the entire period, you gain the skills, but we're not starting in the same place here.
You're not.
It's just not fair.
Yeah. And that's something we absolutely have to address is that. And I'm interested to know. So, you know, something that we typically see with South African private school kids coming from, you know, their school, where they have, you know, gained their sort of network and their sort of, you know, group of friends. And typically people migrate in groups, right? So like 30 of us will go to this school, 20 of us will go, to this university, you know, 30 of us will go to Stellenbosch, you know, 10 of us will go to this other one, you know, 25 of us will go to Wits. And we typically see, at least, I'm not sure what it was like, you know, when you were at university, but at least when I was at university, at UCT in particular, that people have their cliques, and they very much don't venture out of those cliques. You know, as they sort of transition into university, people end up having the same friends that they had back in Frick, and don't necessarily venture too much out of that circle, and, you know, gravitate to people who are like themselves, who have the same issues as themselves. I'm interested to know, what was your transition like? You know, coming from a South African private school, going into an environment like UCT, you know, Africa's best university, studying an absolutely amazing degree, but from a social perspective, what was that transition like?
Yeah, it was very stark. So I'll be quite honest with you. So I actually didn't keep a lot of my friends from school. I
Mm.
didn't like, even though I was head prefect, I think I got along with a lot of people. And I spent a lot of time actually like working on the people in younger grades. So like the grade eights, the nines, the tens, looking after them. And,
Yeah.
and the people in my boarding house were my friends.
Yeah.
And a lot of those friends of mine in the boarding house didn't necessarily come to university or come to UCT.
Mm.
When I was at UCT, I made a lot of friends like de novo at UCT, just starting off. Um, and so I actually found that it was like a natural watershed moment where I actually didn't could actually step away
Yeah.
from maybe like a lot of the friends that I had made before. And it
Did
also
you?
was, yeah, it was really great in the sense that it was
Mm.
kind of like a chance to like restart again.
Yeah.
But that said, like the stuff that you described, I really benefited from that in the sense that there was a guy at my school who had also done debating.
Mm.
And he was like 2 years ahead of me. And
Mm.
I would chat to him and I'll be like, how can I get better at debating? And he would tell me. He would take me to the tournaments. I would
Mm.
catch up with him. When he went to UCT, I said, "What res are you in?" And he told me, "Smart, it's the best
Yeah.
one." And then I came to visit him with my mom, and he walked us around campus. He
Yeah.
even took me into the library. He even showed me Vula. He opened Vula and he said, "This is how you check your marks. This is how you do this." So, like, I'm still in matric, but I
Mm.
now knew that there's a thing called Vula. I knew
Yeah.
the point system. I also knew that there was an entity called Smarts Hall and
Mm.
that it was closer to all the lecture rooms than the others. I didn't even know the other things that would go on.
Yeah.
So when I came time for me to apply to say like I want to go to a res or something, I said Smarts Hall. Then when
Mm.
I arrived there, I saw like the historical differences in all these reses. And yeah, so it definitely benefited me from that perspective. But I think it's what's really awesome for me was that I had a really diverse group of friends now in varsity from different
Mm.
backgrounds, different provinces. Like I was the only Joe Burger. There were only like okay, there were two or three of us.
Yeah.
All the friends that I made in Smarts, I
Yeah.
still chat with them. We lived in a digs together for 5 years,
Yeah.
right? Best man at someone's wedding. But yeah, that was
That's amazing.
UCT was the first time. Not the first time, but I think my identity as a South African was forged there because I could
Yeah.
see through medicine like the real poverty, the difficult history we have,
Mm.
all the sharp ends,
Mm.
gangsterism, drugs. At UCT, this thing about like racist institutional practices. How do people pass exams when they also have to like protest for their survival?
Exactly.
And I guess no, I don't want to labor this point, but when I was at Stithians, it wasn't just my parents who were paying my school fees. It
Mm.
was also like my sisters who contributed. And in my
Yeah.
final year, I was very lucky to have a scholarship that paid half my fees because I was head boy. But coming to
Mm.
UCT, a number of events like hit our family where my I no longer had the ability to pay fees. And that year really transformed me because I nearly got kicked out of UCT.
Mm.
That's when you see, like, at that point, I was not a South African citizen. I
Yeah.
couldn't apply for any South African scholarships.
Mm.
I tried, trust me.
Yeah.
I called here to there, and like my marks were fine, they were good, but I could not raise the money. And that's when I saw all these things that people read about in the newspaper that, like, universities like the University of Cape Town have problems with assisting students from difficult financial backgrounds to stay. I experienced it because guess what? I got that letter which says that you're on your way out, buddy. We can't
Yeah.
help. I even went to the deputy dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences. I asked for them to release my results so that I could get access to a student loan, but my
Mm.
mom couldn't be a surer. UCT said no, they wouldn't
Mm.
release my results. The
Yeah.
only reason why I finished my degree at UCT and is actually because I had to write a letter. I'd given up. I had literally given up. I wrote a letter to the headmaster of my old high school, Stithians, and I said, "Sir, this is what's happened. I'm going to leave UCT in my 4th year of my medical degree. My marks are fine. Here they are. Do you know any parent, anyone who's willing to help me to just try and get just like this year to pay back the money that I owe so that I can try and finish my medical degree? That afternoon, I don't know what he did. He must have called some people and he basically told me, don't worry, it's solved.
So you said you called your old headmaster, and that sort of got you, the funding that you needed at the time. But so what was that process like? I mean, there must be more to that story. I'm quite curious to hear more about it.
Yeah, so actually I called my old headmaster and we started chatting about different options. And he encouraged me to basically consider an option around student loans. Now the problem around that was I didn't have a surer, right? Because like my mom was not in a financial position to do that. And so guess who ended up being my surer on my student loan that enabled me to finish?
Who was it?
My grade 10 English teacher, Miss Wendy Robb. And a shout out to her. Like
she actually interviewed me before when I arrived for my grade. Well, I was in grade 6 at the time.
Yeah.
For grade 8. That's a small world. Wow.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. No, she I can't put it into words. I owe her a lot. I would not have finished at UCT if it's a big thing to be the surer on someone else's debt.
Yeah.
And she took that on for me. It's the only way I could be able to get finance. So this is what I mean by, like, in a sense, like the social capital and the networks that these places can afford is that if it wasn't for that, right, it was just going to be another story of young Black scholar excluded from UCT because of finances.
Yeah.
Right. And through the passion and dedication that like teachers maybe have, whether it's public school systems or independent school systems, if it wasn't for that, like if it wasn't for the passion and dedication that teachers have in our high schools, I wouldn't have made it through UCT. And I won't lie, I mean, like, that's why I struggle so much with UCT, in the sense that, like, you're in your 4th year, you're passing, and
everything is fine. Yeah.
But not even asking for money. They won't even release your results. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that really outlines some of the social and financial disparities that exist, which I think we as a generation need to absolutely put it on a high priority, that this be solved, that we don't go through the same experiences, that our kids don't go through the exact same experiences, and that we take care of each other as people. As you rightly pointed out earlier, that you as a human being have a place on this earth.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely important. I want to ask you, why medicine? Right. So what made you choose to study medicine? What sort of led you into that direction?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make a difference. And I think I'll say this clearly, is that medicine was a profession I could see myself doing for the rest of my life. It's that simple. And Papa, we haven't chatted about this, but I studied architecture at UCT for my 1st year, and then I made the switch to medicine. Through the experiences of being in the architecture classroom, I actually discovered that, like, while I was doing okay at it, it wasn't something that I wanted to pursue for the rest of my life. And I went to Johannesburg General Hospital and I started helping out in the clinics, and I actually realized that medicine combines science, a passion for taking care of people, and all these things that I think I'm naturally good at doing. So it was just clear to me that medicine was the thing to do. Yeah.
That's really powerful. So let's talk about one of the major influences in your life. While you're studying medicine at UCT, and you wanted to touch on a little bit about Prof. Bongani Mayosi, who as I understand it, was a major influence in your life and positively impacted your life. And still today has imparted lessons on your life that are still today relevant and are still today helping you in your everyday life. So tell me a little bit about, that sort of relationship that you had with him and what impact he had on shaping your experience at UCT.
Yeah. So, Bongani Mayosi, where does one start? Bongani Mayosi was a living legend. The thing about Bongani was, he was a short man. I think about like maybe 5'4", 3". But you'd see this man full of so much energy, and he had a little afro because he didn't believe in using chemical products or anything to like hurt black hair, because he said natural black hair needs to grow a certain way, and if you do anything to it, it's gonna like damage your hair follicles. I like to think that he was actually like an Africanist deeply at heart, wearing a fro in a medical hospital. But the thing was, Bongani had this smile and boundless energy. He gave us a lecture about heart disease. And I remember watching this guy and I said, for the first time in medical school, I see someone who looks, sounds like me, came from a similar background, who I now think I can succeed in this place. UCT had some experiences where sometimes you'd be in a tutorial and like a lecturer would sometimes say something like, you're lucky, certain students are quite lucky to be here because of the regulations that are now in place. So especially to you guys, I think you guys should study hard and prepare for these tutorials. Like, in what world do you say things like that? It's pretty loaded. So someone like Wongani would just, what he was looking for was enthusiasm in students and just like a love for science. So I remember writing to him, and I still have the email. In my second year, I wrote to him and I said, Prof. Mayosi, loved your lecture on cardiology. Are there any research projects I can help you with? Even if I'm just like a minion, just like collecting data for something. And immediately he wrote back. I subsequently worked with another professor who was the head of surgery, a lot more on research. But it would be the kind of thing where like, and both of these were professors who were persons of color. Professor Khan was the head of surgery, and he would see Bongani walking on the corridor, and he would open the door and say, Bongani, come and see this one, come and see. And we'd all chat and say, and then Prof. Mayosi would be like, it's not too late to steal you. And things like that, where I could chat with him about research opportunities, about applying for different scholarships to go to different places. When you have these conversations with people like Professor Delavere Khan or with Bongani Mayosi, it wasn't an abstract thing, right? They were like in the case of Bongani, he had been to Oxford. He had fought to get a scholarship to be here, and he made a name for himself in Oxford. Him and his wife are just the kindest, brightest people. And these things for him were like obvious outcomes in a person's life. They weren't like maybes. They were like, okay, if you do this and this, and obviously you're going to work hard, it can happen. And that's, and I just want to add that like my last conversation with Bongani was perhaps the most profound and one that really sticks with me. I was back at UCT during my PhD. I think I bumped into him at the airport randomly, and then he said, like reach out or something. And then I went to his office, and he looked a little bit distant at the beginning. And then we started talking, and I said to him, Prof, you might have noticed that I've been avoiding you for some months. I just want to tell you that I don't know whether I'm going to come back to specialize in medicine anymore. That's like telling a family member that like maybe you want to change your surname. You're done with this family. And and then he said, what do you mean? And then I said, I want to actually I've discovered that my dream is to actually build hospitals. And I want to build a lot of hospitals across Africa because my research shows me that what's missing for our people is having safe places to get healthcare. And Bongani then said to me, it's okay. And I was surprised because normally Bongani would have been like, no. And then he says, don't you just want to come and do community service? Just 1 year.
Yeah.
And I said to him, but I genuinely feel like this is my path. And he said, okay, let me know how I can help you. And then we had like an hour-long conversation. By the way, I now feel bad because our meeting started from 5 until like 7 at night. And Bongani has a million things to do. So he obviously gave me a lot of time.
Yeah.
But at the end of our conversation, he had explained what I should do and everything. And then I said to him, but Prof, you're going to help me, right? And he had this look on his face of like, almost like surprise of like, why would someone ask you? Like, like in my head, I just thought like, it's the kind thing to say like, Prof, thank you. And, I know it's going to work because you're going to help me. And he turned to me and he said, yes, I'll help you. And like literally 6 days later was when it happened, when he passed away. Yeah.
And such a tragic thing to have happened to one of the great giants that this country's ever produced. And I know that people, describe him as a small man, but he's a giant. And a giant soul and a giant heart as well. How did he, positively influence your dream of going to Oxford? So we sort of transitioning now into sort of the next step of the journey of your life.
Yeah.
How did he sort of play a part in that? And when did you start to dream about Oxford? One, and when did you also start to dream about becoming a Rhodes Scholar? And how was that sort of process from the inception of the dream to the reality as well?
So, Bongani had this ability to basically empower a tremendous network of people. So there were several other Black academics, younger academics, who had a direct impact on telling me about, like, let's say what the Rhodes Scholarship was about. When it came time to, once I had applied, would practice interviews with me. People would push me and say, but like you said, you were going to do this thing, do it,
Yeah.
And in hindsight, like whether it was Vuyani Mhlomi, whether it was Ntobeko Ntusi, who is now the head of the Department of Medicine at UCT, and Bongani himself, these are all people who went to Oxford. Do you see what I mean? In the sense that like he created a network of young Black academics and even beyond like Black academics. He empowered students around the world and Africa in specific to aim for their highest dreams and to realize that these were places and disciplines that they could do. So yeah, Bongani would visit Rhodes' house. I'd bump into him at airports. I'd write to him and ask him for advice about projects and stuff with navigating things. He was a phenomenal person. Yeah.
And as we sort of start to look at the becoming a Rhodes Scholar, what convinced you that it was possible? So it's quite a few group of people, right, who have that privilege of doing that and of becoming a Rhodes Scholar and of being in that environment of Oxford in general, but Rhodes Scholarship as well. What was it that convinced you that it's possible? And what was that like, that sort of journey in terms of becoming one? Would you say that it was a one-step dream? Was it just okay, cool, I know I can do this, let's apply, like let's do it, let's go, I believe in myself to shoot for the stars? Like, was it just a one step, or was it sort of a gradual becoming, as it were? Was it a gradual you reaching to your highest self as well throughout that process?
I think it was probably a mix. So, looking back, when I was 13, I came to the UK to visit my sister. My older sister had come to the UK. Well, she went to Canada on a Rotary scholarship, and that's another story on itself. Imagine coming from like Zim and getting a scholarship to go to Canada.
Yeah.
And through that, she got other scholarships and people who in it who she empowered herself, but she had this network that she was building, and that allowed her to come and study at the University of Birmingham. And then in her final year, she was able to spend time in Oxford at the Oxford and Oxford Brookes. I think it's a law school practice that they run. So she was in Oxford during that time. So I came to England. Being 13, all I cared about was fish and chips and playing Age of Empires on a desktop. And I didn't know it at the time, but she was actually like what they call like a junior warden or sub warden in one of these schools that are actually quite close to Oxford University. So she actually walked us into town, and she showed us Oxford. And so even as a 13-year-old, I said, "Oh, this is a nice place. My sister's here, so I can come here."
Why not?
I forgot that. It just happens through time. But when I was 24, my final year of medicine, I had a chance breakfast with one of the old headmasters at Stithians. His name is Ian McLaughlin. I don't know whether you've ever met him.
Yeah, no, I've heard about him. Yeah.
So I was having a catch-up breakfast with Ian, and I told him what had happened in my life, including like nearly being excluded at UCT. And then he said to me, "Young man, like, why didn't you tell me what was going on?" And I said, like, "Well, I'm sorry, it's sorted now." And he says to me, "You know what, like, you need, like I've always told you, that you need to apply yourself to try and push to try and change South Africa. And there's a couple of opportunities that can enable you to do that, and the Rhodes is one of them." And I said, "No, like I'm not a Rhodes scholar. It's not me." And he said, "No, you're going to apply. Like I know the application criteria. You will apply." And then he said, "I will be your referee." So
Amazing.
on, I think like January the 2nd, 2014, I left that breakfast, and he went to write my referee letter. And then he says, "Now you need to go find 5 others, and you will apply for this thing." So yeah, that's how it started for me. That year, that's when I decided I should do this thing.
That was incredibly, I think, impactful, and I think so valuable to have had someone who pushed you to actually I think dream beyond what you could see in the now. What you see around you, dream beyond the past of being maybe a couple of years before that was it for your journey in medicine, right? But to actually push even more, to say, actually, you know what, I'm going to change this country, and I think that's incredibly and so would you say what was the impact of being in an environment like the University of Oxford over the past few years, and a top medical institution, a top institution in general. What's it been like to have been in that environment? And would you say that your friendships that you have kept in life at large have been more intentional over time as well?
Yeah, I've actually been very lucky that the friends that I described that I made early on at UCT, we lived in a house for 5 years together. We still chat. And I think that's what happens. I think at a certain stage in your life, especially when a lot of rough things happen to you, like being excluded and all of this, you just realize who's really there for you, who actually cares, and then you see who doesn't. So it becomes much easier. Hardships makes it easier to see who really belongs in your life and who wants to be there. And so I literally wrote down the names on a list, and it seems to have been a really good list because, it's super easy to keep up those friendships. The others have just fallen by the wayside. Coming to Oxford has also been the making of, I think, the man that I'm becoming.
Yeah.
One of the difficult things about coming to Oxford was, again, entering a space where I think as a Black person, you're a minority. And sometimes like it's a vicious experience.
Yeah.
You know, like I walked through the wrong door this one time, and I was told like you're not gentry, you can't pass through that door. And you know, like now looking back at it, that's not normal, right? That's not what Oxford is about. What
Yeah.
was happening in that experience was something that is not right,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
it's since been rectified. So
Mm.
it's not tradition. Some things we just think it's tradition, but actually there's something else that's going on.
Yeah.
Um, Being a Rhodes Scholar enabled me to be part of like a lifelong community of fellowship. It really is that. So you meet people from around the world who may have been Rhodes Scholars from 50 years ago, and they actually just care about your development.
Yeah.
Um, and the challenge is like the concept of trying to stand up for the world. So that's
Yeah.
been an amazing opportunity. I managed to join a really cool group of friends, and we started a technology incubator that would
Mm.
help people to build startups.
Yeah.
We managed to organize trips to go to San Francisco, and we went to the biggest venture capital firms in the world. So
Mm.
Kleiner Perkins, we went to Sequoia. For those of you who are VC enthusiasts, these names are almost like, you know, like gold plated. And, you know, we met these guys. We were there for hours pitching ideas. And now when I
Mm.
look back at it, I'm just like, wow, we went to SoftBank,
Yeah.
or how they operate. It
Yeah.
was such a great experience. But on a personal front, I think things that I want to be better at as a person came to the fore. So I think particularly growing up in South Africa, sometimes we develop a sense of like toxic masculinity that sort
Yeah.
of crowds out space for either other young men who don't like conform to that, or also, you know, for the most part, women.
Yeah.
And in Oxford, I am regularly, someone will place a mirror in front of me that regularly causes me to question my behavior and the things that I do. Like
Yeah.
the stuff that happens, like let's say in South African social settings at clubs that
Mm.
people do or say, that's just not acceptable outside South Africa.
Yeah.
And I think it's been a valuable experience to learn that, especially quite early on in my Rhodes Scholarship.
That's
And
really powerful.
and more so now, I think being able to have an educational opportunity that allows you to raise significant funds. So I think for my PhD, I must have raised something in the order of what's now 750,000 Rand that
Yeah.
I could spend in South Africa empowering other people in the research community to do collaborative work. So
Nice.
so it enables you to gather resources and actually cause change that would have been actually much more difficult to do had you stayed.
Mm.
And finally, I think this whole idea of being a global citizen, and I'm not saying copping out from belonging to a place, but it gives you a global network of people who care about making the world a better place.
Yeah.
And together you can collaborate on getting a lot of resources together to solve really complex problems that you couldn't do on your own.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really profound. And so bringing it back home,
Yeah,
right? Let's talk a little bit about building a tech-enabled South Africa. You know, I think firstly, let's talk about the challenges that we have to overcome. And I think if I preface this a little bit, I think COVID-19 has highlighted. I don't think it's brought about, you know, the problems. I think it's actually highlighted a lot of the problems we have in the tech-enabled space. In South Africa in particular, I think,
yeah,
as we start to consider things like, schools with
yeah,
remote learning, some schools can seamlessly just adapt and say, kids, stay at home and you'll
yeah,
remote learn, right?
yeah,
Whereas other schools don't even have a computer at the school,
yeah,
right? Don't have clean running water, don't have, you know, soap. The school hasn't seen, proper soaps in the actual bathrooms for months, right? And that sort of, the sort of difference between those two sort of worlds, if it were within one country, really, I think emboldens us to really start to think about this topic, which is, building a tech-enabled South African economy, right? How do we transition with that? And what do you think specifically? What do you think are the challenges that we have to overcome to get there?
Yeah, I think where South Africa is kind of like where China was in 1979. China had
Mm.
a famous leader called Deng Xiaoping, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing it correctly,
Yeah.
but Deng Xiaoping, as well as the rest of the Communist Party of China, and I guess China as a nation, was at a decision where they could follow a path of traditional communism, right? And a way of doing things that would have allowed their growth to happen
Yeah.
at a slow rate and maybe not include everyone, right? Like, and then on the other hand, they had this choice of saying we have to open up to the world,
Yeah.
and in no way am I saying capitalism is the right mode of production to do it, but they had a number of paths to choose, and they chose one that would drive a lot of growth with its
Yeah.
own disadvantages.
Yeah.
But I think, just like Tito Mboweni said 2 days ago, that South Africa, he was quoting the scripture when he said,
Mm.
the wide gate or the narrow gate. South Africa has some stark choices to make. Business
Absolutely.
cannot continue as usual. A 30% unemployment rate that might even end up being 38% by the end of the year, which
Mm.
in truth translates to youth unemployment rates of 70%.
Yeah.
Tafadzwa, 70% of young people, like,
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you have a degree or whatever, are
Yeah.
unemployed,
Right.
is a state that is going to end up in anarchy. People cannot feed themselves. People have no hope for the future. That cannot be the status quo. And
Mm.
what I would like to ask young South Africans is, and not young South Africans, but really all South Africans, but in particular young South Africans,
Yeah.
I don't think that, and I mean this in the best of ways, I
Mm.
don't think that Cyril Ramaphosa, whether it's Helen Ziller, whether it's Tito Mboweni,
Mm.
will understand the kind of world that we need to create for ourselves. We
Yeah.
need to forge a brave, bold South African vision that gets everyone back to work, included in the economy. So when
Yeah.
I hear Tito Mboweni, and it's really difficult. He told us on Thursday, right, that by the end of this year, South Africa's debt will be 82% of our GDP. Just
Yeah.
take a moment to think about that, right?
Exactly.
Like,
Mm.
you and I are going to be at a point where our country spends more on servicing its debt than actually building roads, hospitals, paying teachers, and so on very soon. This concept of a sovereign debt crisis is, having been being a Zimbabwean also, it's a reality. It's not just a construct.
No,
There's a
it hit
risk of it happening.
once it hits hard, it becomes disastrous.
Yeah,
And it really, we have to absolutely, you're quite right, we have to absolutely urgently, right,
yeah,
start to form the economy of the future, but now,
yeah.
right? We
And
can't
how does that
can't
look
make
like?
economy in 20 years time. No,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
to be now. It
Yeah, and that's what I get to, is that how does that economy look like? That economy does not look like the one that's being described by our Minister of Finance, who I
Yeah.
respect hugely as a farmer. One day I wish to have a farm, but you
It's
know,
got a
this is the
farm.
whole thing, like wine, peaches, stuff like that. Like just growing stuff. But that's a topic for another day. But the thing is, when our government announces that it's going to spend 100 billion rand on
Mm,
infrastructure projects, like,
mm,
I admire that, but I think that's like almost like Keynesian economics, looking at like how to get out of the Great Depression. If the
yeah.
idea is to spend for growth, cool, but like, our country does need infrastructure. But what I worry about is what we have in our minds. Is it bridges? Is it stadiums? Is it dams? If you speak to young people and we stop and we say, do we really want more dams?
Yeah.
No. Why don't we
Yeah.
invest in solar farms? Why don't we think about wind energy, right? Things that are easy to scale up and good for the planet. Don't go and build nuclear power stations that we have to deal with in the
Yeah.
not so distant future. My
Absolutely. Yeah.
question is like, and I want to cite people. I want to look at people like Melvin Lubega, like the Harambe Entrepreneurship Society. I want to
Mm,
look at like the young people in Cape Town who are working on startups. Dr. Will Mapham, who's transforming healthcare through his app called Vula. And I'm thinking to myself, if we can create the Amazon of South Africa or Africa, right, in our part of the world, then all you need is a driver's license, an honest character, and you can get a job to deliver goods, right? That is infrastructure in the 21st century. We can talk about job security around those things, but I think we, as particularly younger South Africans, need to fight to create this bold new future.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And I really, love what you said there, because I think, it is almost this. I think there's a part to be said about the intention, right? So I think it's absolutely critical for us to have the right intentions of this new economy, and for us to map it out. But somewhere where I think we and we can talk about our country of birth as Zimbabwe, for example, right? You might have the right intention, but the execution is not up to scratch, and the delivery of the intention is also not up to scratch. So we also have to get to that step as well. So yes, we absolutely need the right vision of the right economy of what we want, right?
Yeah.
But if we're going to build schools, if we're going to build hospitals, as you pointed out earlier, we better execute that properly, right? Not go 85% over budget, right? You know what I mean? It's this thing, or declare insolvency somewhere in the project, and then take your payday and walk away, right?
Yeah.
That for me is, there's almost a responsibility for the vision. There's almost a responsibility to execute the vision based off of the fact that actually we have the right intention. We must have the right intention. But I think whatever we do, we absolutely have to execute it well. And we absolutely have to execute an economy, right? And build that economy for the future, but now. I absolutely think it is the right time. And I think, as you sort of move into to another topic that we want to talk about in terms of our shared vision for what South Africa is to become. At the moment, with COVID-19, I think South Africa has plenty of challenges. I think at the moment the healthcare systems, as we know, are not, it's not in good shape in general. The schools, we can see now, as we sort of try to return to school, that there are lots with that, right? How do you think we go forward? What does South Africa look like, right? And how can we play a part in that?
I'll have you know, Tafa, I want you to know something. You should be proud to be an African in the continent that I think probably has the brightest future in the world. The thing is, having lived in so many different places, I can tell you that, like, in the American entrepreneurial space, it's crowded, right? And quite frankly, people are not solving important problems. Hence George Floyd, hence coronavirus having 2 million cases. And that tells you health systems, education, it's not working. In Africa, look at our COVID response compared to the rest of the world, right? It's not maybe as it doesn't maybe like look like super high tech, but actually it's about first principles, and it's working. And what I want to bring to that is that if you are a young entrepreneur in South Africa, you are probably at the best time. Things like COVID break the status quo. They create, if you imagine, it's like a roof that suddenly has holes in it, and there's opportunities for light to come in and see things that you couldn't see before. And this is what I'm talking about by that certain South Africans who have an opportunity to move the levers on the country are so focused on making big, bold changes, when actually what we need is a sort of bunch of how can I say, a small wave of micro changes that gains momentum to become a tsunami. So in a sense, maybe government has to just get out of the way of people. It must be difficult to open a business, a legal business. And part of the issue is access to capital. About 2 years ago, South African CEOs announced the development of the South African medium enterprise fund.
Yeah.
That fund raised R1 billion, and I think Adrian Gore and Ketso Godan are instrumental figures in leading that. They then developed venture capital vehicles that they're funding. So they gave some existing money to small funds, and
Yes.
then they established a university technology fund between Stellenbosch and UCT. But can you see the problem, Chief? So if you come up with a good idea from UWC, WITS, Pretoria, what's going to happen?
You don't have access.
And then you see that like formerly black universities are not captured, so are not empowered with these funding vehicles for their innovations to make it to the rest of the world. So what I'm advocating for is that, like, don't rely on a government policy to come up with these things. We need to mobilize, if it's crowdfunding or whatever, if it's finding wealthy entrepreneurs who see our vision, both in South Africa and outside. Let's create funding vehicles. I'm going to tell you now, R1 billion is a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
Young entrepreneurs in South Africa must be bold. Create ideas that reach the entire African continent. And I promise you, if you can reach the thousands, you can get access to much bigger capital in outside South Africa. And I'm happy to be part of that plan to help people, particularly in the healthcare sector, build continent-wide businesses, right? That break barriers and make the government sit up and say, wow, South Africans are doing it for themselves. Let's listen to what their vision is.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And what kinds of people do you think we need, to make South Africa a better place and to build that future that we so hope for?
Tafa, I think we need people who have the personality of breaking things, but also making things, right? In the same person. And also like this sense of like not following rules that keep, things working well and keeping trust and also keeping good governance, but people who don't respect conventional rules that do not make sense. And by that, I want to give you the personality of a runner. Tafa, have you ever been number one in a race? Even for like a minute in the race, you look back and you were ahead.
Beginning,
Okay. What's the psychology of running number two versus running number one?
Number two always has, a target. You want to be number one.
Yeah. And when you're number one, the scary thing is now you have to set the pace.
You have to set the pace. And you don't know whether you are running quickly or not.
Yeah. And exactly. But you run towards a vision, right? You see yourself crossing the finish line and the exhilaration of all that effort and winning. And at some point in the race, you decide it's probably easier for me to put in the effort now and win than to like get tired and concede and be second, because you still have to run that race next week or next year and try and prove the same. So it's better to just put it all over the line.
Yep.
And I think as South Africans and as Africans, we have an opportunity to take control of our destiny. We have an opportunity to think about the vision of the kind of world where we are respected, active participants, and world beaters. Healthcare, finance, agriculture, you name it. We forge that vision, we run the race. When we get to number one, we start now thinking about number one psychology. But until you get to number one, no one believes you that you can be. I tell you this, I've run lots of races in my life.
Yeah.
The surprise that people have on their face when they're like, but that guy is now number one. No. But you have to believe in it from day one when you start the race. And the thing is, in our post-democratic race of South Africa, of trying to get to where we need to be, we are not yet the best of what we can be. And I think we need to realign ourselves to the vision of what that is. It could be your own vision of like running a successful small enterprise, of being a great teacher, of being a great medical doctor, being a great academic, just making sure that institutions are working. But once we are all behind that vision in our lives of building a better future, no one can hold us back.
Well, we'll be unstoppable. We'll be absolutely problem. And I think what you said is it's extremely powerful. You know, and so, you know, another question that we had from the Q&A is, you know, so what types of people, you know, will we look to as major successes in the next 10 years? So what kinds of people, you know, today will we look at in 10 years' time as major successes?
I can even give you names if you want, but I don't know whether that's allowed. You know
Yeah,
something? The last 3 weeks have been very profound for me. Watching George Floyd, I think last year, watching Greta Thunberg with the climate change crisis protests and movement. And I can tell you, I have a firm belief that the leaders of tomorrow are our generation. I don't think cares about the things that made the status quo kind of work.
yeah,
It's quite striking. I'm not sure, like the millennials and Generation Zs. Obviously, there's a cultural and national flavor, right, in each
yeah,
geographic space. Care so much about things like money in the same way that I think maybe other generations do. Don't get me wrong, I don't think people want to suffer, but I also think people would rather have clean air than be billionaires with a scorched planet, right? And I
yeah,
genuinely think that there is a tsunami that's coming
mm,
around people's expectations of good governance,
mm,
long-term thinking. But I
mm,
also think having laws that create freedom around personal freedoms, like, for instance, sexuality, personal choices, educational choices, you know, even down to like transport, what you get, land ownership, all of
yeah,
these questions. But I think matched with that is a passion and resolve to finish the job. That's
yeah,
what Rhodes Must Fall looks like in South Africa.
yeah,
That's what George Floyd looks like in America. And you
mm,
know what? That's what it looks like in many of the political and economic crises that are going around the world. A
yeah,
lot of the time, it's people who are fed up, and a lot of them young, who have this different, more nuanced, more egalitarian vision of the world that is in such sharp odds with the
mm.
current class of decision makers. And it's
Right.
unstoppable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really, really powerful. And Tinashe, as we draw to a close, and I think you have shared some really incredible wisdom with us, and I think, you know, if anybody's listening to this, you better rewind and start from the top and start taking notes,
Yeah.
right? Because I think there's really been some really educational and inspirational words, lessons, and knowledge that you've shared. I've got two questions for you to finish off.
Yeah.
Both came from our Q&A. The first one is, you know, so, uh, you know, do you, you know, how do you, as a, okay, this is you to actually answer second, so not first. The
Okay.
first question I want you to answer is, you know, as a dual citizen, right? Do we have a responsibility to feed both our countries? So South African and Zimbabwean put together, do you have responsibility to feed both of our countries? And the second question is a bit more, you know, pertaining to you as an individual, which is that, you know, how do you find the balance between your personal life and pursuing your ambitions?
Okay. Okay. So the first question is actually a lot easier for me.
Yeah,
Um, I am I am I, I am both South African and Zimbabwean, and I would even say that, like, it's not in a dual citizen kind of way. It's more
mm,
like in a code switching kind of way. You know, like
yeah,
how you can move from one social setting. Like,
yeah,
I love Zimbabwe. It's in my DNA. It's where I was born. I speak the language. I have so many relatives where it is home for me. Like, it is visceral. In the
mm,
same way that, even though for South Africa it's an acquired thing, my
mm,
love for South Africa runs deep. It is visceral. It's
mm,
evident by the fact that in a pandemic, I made sure that I would spend some time at home with my family in
mm,
Johannesburg. As an African first, I think that I have a responsibility to give back to my continent. I
yeah,
think I'm uniquely positioned to understand the cultural dimensions of both Zimbabwean and South African life. And because of how much people in both countries have sacrificed in my own development, I owe it to them. Like, I
mm,
really do deeply feel that way. I love South Africa. I want to see it work. I was trained as a medical doctor in South Africa. I had a
yeah,
wonderful education. I feel a moral obligation to give back.
Mm, mm, mm. And and I think that's a really powerful response, and one that I think is linked to your identity. And so the second question in terms of how do
Yeah,
you balance your personal life?
yeah,
So you having a personal life,
yeah.
and you actually pursuing your ambitions, and being quite busy at that, I'm sure.
I think Tafazo, I think it's just a mess, man. Let's just be honest. It's a balanced mess. It looks like a salad. That's the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes I'm way too busy with work and I'm way too focused on that. But
Mm,
I see the long-term picture. I see where I'm gonna land up and the good that I can do in the world alongside others. That's what
mm,
drives me. So I
mm,
do what needs to be done to get things done. Means
mm.
waking up at 4, I'll do it. If it means not sleeping, I'll do it. But there
Yeah.
comes a point where you have to ask yourself, if you give so much of yourself, but you can't restore your own cup, that's not going to help anyone, especially you.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm very lucky with is I think I have a network of people around me who can probably tell me if I'm starting to do things that are too much.
Yeah.
And I have a wonderful partner who reminds me of I think some of the things that are more important than just trying to go for these big goals. So
Yeah.
you know what, like being a bit more present is something that I need to get better at. So sometimes you can make time to be at some place, but like mentally
Yeah.
you're not
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what I need to get good at, I think, going forward is being present
Mm,
in conversations, in people's lives. And, this whole thing of like chasing your dreams, doing PhDs, um, trying to build major companies, it is very, it can end up being a very selfish process, right? Because like you actually gain a lot from it.
yeah.
But you need to be present for other people's victories in your
People.
life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. And I know we've come to a close, and this has been
Yeah.
a jam-packed session.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you, for one, coming onto the show and availing of your time. I know that you're a busy person. Two, for not just being on the show, but absolutely giving us pearls of wisdom. But I also think as well, giving us something to think about in many sort of different fields and cases. I think you spoke a lot about how your journey, right? In your journey, you managed to sort of immerse yourself in a culture, and you managed cultures rather, and you managed to sort of listen and understand people. I think there's so much power in that. And as we sort of moved into your experience into UCT, the power of actually deciding that this is your dream and this is what you want, as you've sort of gone through your life, is I think really powerful. And I think this is definitely, I think, to anybody listening or watching this, has given people a lot of inspiration and given people a lot of power, um, to propel themselves forward. So I just want to thank you so much,
Yeah.
for coming onto the show. I would love to have you back again, in the future. This is a long-term initiative. It's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah.
So we'd love to have you back again. But thank you for being a part of the community. Thank you for joining the conversation, and thank you for impacting and educating and inspiring people's lives as well.
Yeah. Tafadzwa, thank you very much for hosting me, and to your listenership who are out there, let's fight for a better South Africa, and let's do that starting today. And you can hold me to account about my part in that.
Mm.
And I just really believe that the events of the last couple of weeks are a real turning point in the world, but also for South Africa. And
Yeah.
thank you for giving me this platform.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Dr. Tinashe Chandauka, thank you so much for joining the show. I hope that you stay safe, you stay
Yeah.
healthy,
Yeah.
have a wonderful weekend further. Even as a Man United fan, I hope
Oh,
that
this guy. Yeah, and goodbye to your audience, and goodbye to Fadzo. Thank you.
thank you so much. Cheers.